The joys of Zoom and working from home. At least it's not
Exactly.
a cattail.
Exactly.
So welcome to your 10th Global Sentiment Survey. That's just amazing. And as we were chatting before, New Zealand's 6th, or take that first one out because we had such low numbers, our 5th with you, so halfway through. And we didn't get you down like we promised, which is like next year, please come down to New Zealand, have a visit.
I'd love to. One day we will. One day we'll get it together.
Yes, absolutely. So, and welcome everybody online. Thank you for jumping online at this hour. Sometimes it's a bit tricky with school drop-offs and things, so thank you. If you want to drop in the chat where you're all calling in from this morning, I'm in Christchurch. We're at 7 degrees. And thank you, Donald, who is the chairperson of the Learning Performance Institute in the UK, amongst many other directorships which I see popping up. So you've become a professional director, chairman, doing lots of great things in the L&D space.
Doing things. Let's let other people decide whether they're great or not. Yeah.
Well, I think they're great. So yeah, a vote of one. I'm sure there's many more. So I'll hand over to you, because people are not here to hear me; they're here to hear you. And yeah, really look forward to these results. So over to you. Thank you for joining us in your evening while the steak waits downstairs.
Yes, I've got that steak waiting for me downstairs. We've got a couple of weather checks. I mean, I don't know what the temperature is here. Yeah, I'm sure there should be something. Oh, I took it off my taskbar. It's about the same as you guys. You've got Auckland, Nelson, Kerry, in LA. Gosh, Angela, is that bona fide LA on the West Coast? Okay. Auckland, Bali 16. Auckland. A lot of voices from Auckland. Good to see you all here.
Who's in Bali? I'm jealous.
I think we got a bunch of people. Kia ora from Wellington, and kia ora to you too, Angela. Great to be here. Let me share my presentation and kick off. You may be familiar with these. I will give an introduction to this whole thing as we go through it, but it's effectively, as Rusty was saying, this is the 10th Global Sentiment Survey. I haven't made that much fuss about that. Oh, sorry, it's saying at the moment your shared screen can only be seen by hosts and co-hosts. Why is that? Do you need to give me some special rights? Do you need to make me a co-host, possibly? Can't hear what you're saying if you are saying anything indeed.
Yep. Made you the co-host. See if that helps. Okay.
Participants can now see your application.
Great.
Which is that slide deck. Cool. 10th year of the survey, focusing on the results for, well, looking at the results for the world, but also looking at the results for New Zealand in particular. And New Zealand's always a little bit unique, completely unique. I know you can't qualify a superlative, but the New Zealand results are always different. I'm going to press on, and at some point I'm going to ask you what your greatest challenge is for this year in about 3 or 4 slides time. So just think about that, if you would, and I will, I'll come to that in a second. So I'm calling this "Is a New Era?" question mark. Actually, it's my belief that it is a new era in learning and development, and I'll explain why as we go on. I want to say thank you to the people who make it possible. I've got sponsors, I've got media partners, and of course, country partners like Bloom. Thank you very much, Rustic, for making it possible to get people, so many votes in from New Zealand to help us get the word out and get the information in from across the world. So here we go. 5 points we're looking at in the next hour, 55 minutes. Looking at the results for this year. My big thing, which is that data is back this year with a vengeance. We're going to focus on New Zealand, look at the key challenges that people have been talking about, and then wrap up with a couple of slides on conclusions. Okay, looking at the results for this year. Every year I ask one question to the world, which is, what will be hot in workplace learning and development? That's one obligatory question. It's been the same question for the past 10 years. There are a couple of other questions which I asked, which I'll come to in a minute. This question was answered by 3,996 people from 100 countries across the world, and you can see the distribution there. SWP at the bottom for Australia and New Zealand stands for Southwest Pacific. I've shifted my names of regions towards stuff that's more coherent with the UN standard naming conventions for parts of the world. You can see, if you look at this, that UK and Europe in the middle there is actually accounting for 50% of all the votes. So the vote is not equally distributed. And we'll have a look in a minute or a bit later on at how the vote isn't equally distributed. But as each year goes by, it becomes more and more, it becomes better and better distributed. So that's where people are voting from geographically. The two other questions which I ask people are, well, first one is which describes where you work best. You can see here from this that 49% of people come from workplace. Well, sorry, this is a voluntary question, so we don't know it's that many, but 86% of people answered it. So it's the vast majority of people answered it. And of those, 49% come from workplace learning and development. And the rest is spread around, as you can see, between education vendors, consultants, and other things. And there is another question which I ask people, which is, what's your biggest learning and development challenge this year? Now, that's the question I said I was going to ask you earlier on. I'd like to ask it now. While I have a quick sip of tea, could you just drop in the chat, what is your biggest challenge for this year? Now, you can see at the bottom there that 40% of people answer this question. 1,600 people giving their views on it, 18,000 words. It's a lot. And I read through all of them and I get an idea of what the challenges are. So if you want to just put in the chat what your biggest L&D challenge was, I'm going to have a sip of tea and reflect on your answers. There we go. Susan, thank you for that. When you talk about recruiting restrictions, is that recruiting into your team? If so, please let us know. And thank you also for sending it to everyone. So, and Barnett says, the organization making time for learning. Lorna agrees, simply carving the time out for our people to undertake learning. If you're sending the message, I won't repeat it to everybody else if you send it to me directly, but if you do, if you can share it to everyone, that's great. It really helps us understand what's going on. Cage says, engaging learners in professional development during intense organizational change, prioritizing formal learning. Michelle, when you say that, do you mean that you want to give people informal learning, or it's a problem getting them to prioritize it? Steve says, motivating learners to engage in learning. We have a very strong job market. Yeah. Into teams throughout the organization, Susan. Okay, so recruitment's tough throughout. Yeah, few people saying that there's this issue with basically it's a strong market for employment at the moment. Understanding capability gaps, says Phil, and measuring how well the gap is closed. Budget cuts, says Helen. Look, these are all really interesting, and thank you for sharing them. If nothing else, I hope reading everybody else's answers there gives you the feeling that you're not alone. And there's a sense, isn't there, of a number of common themes, one of which is time, another of which is engagement, budgets, or resources generally. So Susan said budgets and also getting people to come in. But there's also larger strategic things, as Phil says, understanding the capability gaps and so on. Yeah, Helen says budget cuts rather than learning dictating the medium. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm totally on board with that one, Helen. By the way, none of these are unique to you. They are being felt across the world. And one of the interesting things about the answers to this question, there are loads of regional variations when it comes to answering the first question. What's going to be hot, what's not? But when it comes down to the challenges, there is remarkably little variation. Ukraine obviously had unique challenges, but everybody else, there's very common themes across the board, very much like what you're talking about here. Great. All right, I'm going to press on, but if you want to drop any more challenges in there and just share your woes, that's absolutely all right. We're here to listen to each other. Bethany says, yeah, the business making time, loss of experienced students through attrition, And again, it's that resourcing issue Steve's pointed to. You can't get hold of good people. Those 18,000 words, by the way, if you know the book Le Petit Prince, it's the length of Le Petit Prince. So basically, I've got to read a book each year when I ask people this question about what their challenges are. But it's a privilege to hear what's going on in the world. Now, one thing I always point out every year is that just as the vote isn't distributed equally across the world, it's not distributed equally across the diffusion of innovation curve of Everett Rogers, which you'll be familiar with. People are scattered, people come from not all over this, but largely from over on the left-hand side with the innovators and the early adopters. I will come back to this later on, but that's where they are. That's okay, because that's what I'm interested in. They're accumulated down there. I want to know what people are talking about this year, because I want to know which of the ideas that are hot now are going to be adopted later on. In other words, I think the ideas that are hot now will go down the line in 3 or 4 years' time, will be regarded as being much more general practice or interesting by the early majority, and then get more widely adopted. Just to be clear, it isn't the case that everything that the innovators and early adopters find interesting, it isn't the case that all those things will be adopted. But it is the case that everything which does get widely adopted by the early majority and so on was once thought interesting by the innovators and early adopters. So that's what I'm trying to find with this survey. What are the things people are talking about? What's hot? What are they going to go on to exploit in the coming years? Here's my list of things that I ask people to choose from. I give them a list of 15 things plus other, and they could choose 3 of these things to describe what will be hot this year. Very quickly, you can see the metaverse is new this year. Very quickly, while I have another sip of tea, could you just let me know in the chat, which of these things do you think is going to be hot this year? Yes, and of course, as you know, it doesn't have to be on the list. You could write something else. I'll put just one, but if you want to put down 2 or 3 in your answer, that's absolutely fine. It's very funny. Normally, the thing that comes up first on the list is AI, because it's only 2 letters and it's very easy to type. All right, well, look, thank you for that. We've got a couple of votes for microlearning and a couple of votes for consulting more deeply with the business, showing value, reskilling, upskilling. All right. Shall I reveal what other people in the world said? I will in just a moment, but first, before I throw up a big table of what 4,000 people worldwide thought, I just want to point out that that is the opinion of those people, but there's no right and wrong. Each culture, each company, each context is unique. So what is important for you, what you think will be hot this year, that's important for you. Yes, Steve, I'm going to give a QR code at the end, and you can download it straight away. I'll also send it over to Bloom so that Rustica can distribute it as well. So the slides will be available afterwards. Thank you for asking. Okay, so here's the result of what people worldwide thought was going to be hot. Reskilling and upskilling, number 1. AI, skills-based talent management. I'll give you a moment just to look at that. You've got the option, then the number in brackets is where it was last year. The percentage, obviously, is the share of people voting for it. Little arrow going up or down says whether the percentage was higher or lower than last year's. Now, I'm pressing on slightly fast because I've got a whole bunch of stuff about New Zealand that I want to talk about and get your views on. But feel free if you want me to slow down or ask questions, just chuck it in the chat. Firstly, very quickly looking at reskilling and upskilling, that was number 1. The definition, reskilling, you've got new skills for a different job. Upskilling, you're going up in your current job and you're progressing. Why was that for the 3rd year, number 1? Well, if we look back to a Google Trends search for reskilling and upskilling, you can see that at some point about the middle of 2019, it picked up as a trend that people were interested in finding out more about. And that was fueled by conferences and talks, and in particular by this paper on the 22nd of January 2020 from the World Economic Forum that was put out saying we need to reskill everybody. That was just as COVID was breaking outside China and people were starting to lock down. But up to that point, reskilling and upskilling was all about making sure people had the skills they needed for the future world of work. Then it became, for the next 2 years, a matter of reskilling, upskilling to get ourselves ready for the world after COVID. So there's two reasons why people are voting for this. It is real. It is just that the reason for reskilling and upskilling may have changed over time. My view is that what happens when the World Economic Forum puts a paper out, everybody jumps on it, all the consultancies, every analyst has their own take on it, and the words get out there, and it becomes part of what I call our wordscape, a landscape of words that surround us. And then if you ask somebody about something, unconsciously, they choose reskilling and upskilling as being important because it's something they've seen surrounding them. I don't want to spend a lot of time on reskilling and upskilling, except for just to look at the results for the first year it came out, which was 2 years ago, and then the results for this year. So 2021, when we first put it on the list, the vote for reskilling and upskilling was remarkably high and consistent worldwide. That 14% in the middle is just the rest of the world. So the votes for that year were pretty consistent, 13% in most of the world, 12% down under, 9% in Brazil, where they are somewhat skeptical about the whole thing. Move forward to this year, you can see that the Brazilians remain unchanged at 9.3%. Everyone else's votes has come down, and it's very uneven. Huge vote in Malaysia for reskilling, upskilling, but everywhere else, it's much lower. And in fact, if it hadn't been for that vote in Malaysia, the overall vote would have been 11.5% rather than 12%. So there was a big drop in the vote for reskilling and upskilling amongst people who'd voted for it previously, and it was uneven. So basically, we can expect the vote to keep falling away for reskilling and upskilling. I want to look at the bottom of the table quickly, just to point something out. You might say, why is mobile delivery even on this list on? It's just something we do all the time. Of course it is. 10 years ago, when I started the survey, it was number one. It was the really hot thing. And so what happened was, of course, over the course of time, it went down. That's the natural trend for what happens with an option on this list. Something goes from being super exciting to being, well, it's business as usual, if it's widely adopted. Not all things are widely adopted. If you look at curation, for example, that started off as being something people were quite excited about, and it also fell down at about the same rate as mobile delivery. And then I took it off the list last year. Why did curation fall down? Well, not because, like mobile delivery, it became business as usual. I think rather that was something people were excited about, and then they found it was a bit more difficult than they thought. So there are two things here that are going on, which happens to every option, which is either it goes from super exciting to business as usual, like mobile, or I'm excited to, I can't really be bothered with this, which is what happened with curation. I'm not saying curation is not important or useful. It's just that it's much more difficult to do than a lot of people imagine when they start down the path, and they then transfer their affections to something else. Okay, so that's a quick overall look at it. Now I want to look at what I think the top of the table, apart from reskilling and upskilling, tells us about what's happening in learning and development at the moment. And bear in mind, the question here is what's hot, right? It's not about what you're going to do. It's not about practical activities. Well, it's about sentiment, what people feel is important. And I think, though, that the return of data, as I put it here, is something that has shifted. I think it demonstrates there's a shift in people's attention and what they're focused on. Let me explain what I mean. Here's the top of the table. 3 green arrows going up, that's in positions 2, 3, and 4. AI, skills-based talent management, which means understanding the skills gaps you've got, and then using data from people, from job descriptions and so on, to train and recruit to fill those gaps, and learning analytics. Now, AI, if you look at second position there, 9.2%. Last year was at 12th position. that's a big jump from 12 to second. Here's how big it was. Now, look, you can see VR and AR in yellow, virtual and augmented reality, and AI in blue. And they're following the same sort of curve, excitement, and then it's dying away. Bit of a jump last year, bit of a bounce back, but basically they're heading in the same direction as mobile delivery, that slide we saw earlier. But this year, something happened. Virtual and augmented reality continue on that downward path. We'd expect them to, but artificial intelligence jumped back 4.5%. That's utterly unprecedented. Nothing like that has ever happened before. Why? Anybody want to tell me in the chat, why did artificial intelligence undergo this extraordinary renaissance when we were expecting it to follow the line that virtual and augmented reality did? Anybody want to tell me in the chat why? Yeah, you're right. You're right. ChatGPT. Thank you. Paul, Lorna, Michelle. Yeah, absolutely. ChatGPT was the open public consumer manifestation of work that's been taking place in AI and large language models for at least 2 decades. It seemed to have come from nowhere. Of course, it didn't, but its effect was enormous. So here we have ChatGPT, and as soon as it came out, everyone was reacting to it and bringing up all their scare stories, melodrama about what it could and couldn't offer. Those quotes are taken from the middle of February, so about a month ago. Already they feel a bit out of date. But Steve, if you've got any top tips for using ChatGPT to increase productivity, please drop them in the chat. We could all benefit from that. I've tried using it for a couple of things that did not help me because I was using it to write words and I didn't find them particularly good. But there are loads of people doing really exciting things with it. Of course, the thing is that ChatGPT is based on the third version of the large language model. The fourth version is about to be released. And it is, I think it's something like has a million times larger data set than ChatGPT 3. We can expect everything to just keep accelerating. Going back to that idea of the wordscape, look, here's the Google Trends analysis for what happened with ChatGPT. It was nothing, right? That completely horizontal flat blue line. And then they launched it on 30th of November. It kind of picked up. Then 8th of December, I launched my survey. Well, of course, everyone was talking about it. There's a dip there for Christmas and it carries on. The bizarre thing was you could actually see the votes, the interest in artificial intelligence picked up during the course of the survey. It was about number 7 around Christmas time, and then it kept gaining and gaining and gaining as this line grew. So it was really a matter of what I call the wordscape, that online environment of words that we're listening to and picking up on, and it affects how we vote on things. But the vote wasn't universal. Strangely, if you look at it, the North America, where we'd expect it, I would have expected it to be stronger, wasn't where it got the biggest votes. The biggest votes came from Turkey and Israel. That's what that big 13.8% is, the middle. And Europe, 9.6%. Actually, to be fair, France, Germany, Poland, which is the bulk of continental Europe, voting for it very strongly, but that vote's dragged down by the UK, which was 8.6%. Bit suspicious of ChatGPT. Steve's raised a really good point in the chat, which is that the work of the future is going to be about not being replaced by AI, which is what all those reports about reskilling and upskilling were about, but about using it effectively to augment what we do. He says, it's not perfect, but it's really good at developing outlines and generic content, but it needs checking. So you can use it to get a job maybe 50, 80% done, and then you use your human power to get the rest of it done. But look at it another way, that means that 4/5 of the job is done for you when you arrive at your desk. Steve, great example. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. So unevenly distributed votes. Let's look at those 3 points again: AI, skills-based talent management, and learning analytics. But let's look at how they're distributed across the workforce. Remember I said there are these 4 areas of the workforce. Well, actually I said there were 5, but we're not bothering with other at the moment. Bear in mind, AI is this sort of salmony color. I got this wrong when I was looking at these results, and I was very surprised by them. Look at these. Which do you think, which of these four groups is going to vote the highest for AI? When asked the question, what do you think will be hot this year? Which of these four groups, when I put the survey out in December and January, responded most strongly to the idea that AI was going to be hot? I'm going to have some more tea. Please just drop it in. Now, I thought it was going to be L&D, because I do a lot of work with startups, and my startups tend to be doing a lot of work around using leading edge tools to develop stuff. But actually, you are right. There's a vast majority of people here. Well, actually, a lot of people began with education, then we had a switch over to self-employed. But let me reveal the answer. You can see that actually workplace L&D, only 6.9%. I was very surprised by that. Whereas education, you're right, anybody voted for that, 13.8%. And although, it's number 2 for the self-employed, that was a good bet. If you look at the numbers graphically, 13.8% is twice 6.9%, and it beats the other two into a cocked hat. It's a huge, huge vote for it by education. The reason being, of course, that educators were very concerned about plagiarism, and a whole system of education that was based on providing people with information and then getting it back in written form could be undermined. They saw by ChatGPT. I think they should take a leaf out of Steve's book and Rustica and everybody else who's been using AI, to just try it out and actually see that you can. I think that maybe your doorbell we're hearing, or somebody's doorbell. So if your doorbell's going off and your microphone is live, you might want to mute it. Let's go to the top of the table then and look at these four options. And this looked very exciting to me. I thought, great. We've had a shift from what we had during the pandemic. During the pandemic, it was coaching and collaborative learning that were number one. Or no, sorry, they weren't number one, but they were 2 and 3 on the table. But now these four options are largely driven by data. And then I went back to the report for 2020, and this is the slide that you will have seen in 2020, when I said, yes, data is here. And then it went away during the pandemic because we were so busy trying to just get the job done of running learning and development for organizations during a pandemic. And then it came back this year. So learning analytics was number 1. It's now number 4. Now, personalization and so on doesn't require it, but AI is there as well. It's very, very unusual for things to drop out and then come back up. And that's exactly what's happened. And it's happened, as you were saying, because of ChatGPT. We're going to look later on at the implications of this when I look at the conclusions, because I think they are huge for us in L&D. But firstly, before we do that, let's look at New Zealand. I love this photograph of all the different places in the world from Bluff, New Zealand, wherever that is. I am personally 18,958 kilometers from Bluff, New Zealand. Credit to Miki Group, who produced the photograph. It's given there. Right, so looking at New Zealand, thank you to Bloom for making best oysters in the world. Well, my wife, when we come and visit, my wife will want to take you up on that with a nice drop of New Zealand white wine.
Done.
Looking at the distribution of people who voted, we saw earlier it was 49% for the overall population, but the word workplace L&D, I think it's the largest population of workplace L&D people in any of the key countries. There are 18 key countries who voted for 100 people or more voted, and 62% were workplace L&D in New Zealand. So that's interesting. So shows you've got a good reach into the workplace space there. Rustica, thank you for that. Let's look at how the results shape up against the world. And Steve, you asked if you could download the files, download the results later on. You absolutely can. And I'm going to go through these reasonably quickly, not too fast, but you might want to go back and look at them later on. I've just noticed something actually, which is it's quite unusual, as you'll notice on the right hand side of New Zealand. The top 3 are all above 10%. It's quite unusual, and it shows a sort of a consistency you're not over backing one thing, but there's a strong sense of casting your vote across three things. First thing I just want to point out is that coaching and mentoring in New Zealand, much higher than anywhere else, and it was the number one of all the 18 key countries. New Zealand voted. New Zealand was the only one that put coaching and mentoring first. It didn't actually vote the most for it, but it was the one that put it first amid all the countries. The country that voted most for it, I think, was Malaysia, then Brazil, then New Zealand. But let's have a look at the ones which are higher in New Zealand than the rest of the world. Coaching and mentoring up, consulting more deeply with the business up, showing value up. Now those two, consulting with the business and showing value, are the classic duo that show there's an interest in actually trying to make the learning support business needs. I'm interested in your comment there, Steve. Anything else you want to tell me about Maori pedagogical approaches? I would love to know more. This is how I get to learn more about the world. So please tell me. At the same time, of New Zealand voting so highly for those, and by the way, consulting more deeply with business was the highest vote across 18 key countries. There were also areas where New Zealand didn't vote so much, and actually it was those things I've just been talking about, 2, 3, and 4 on the main list, didn't make it in, only just made it number 8 in the top half of the table. It's a huge difference there. Normally you don't get that bigger shift between New Zealand and the rest of the world. And this is what I was saying at the beginning about New Zealand being unique. It absolutely is unique. We always get results which are peculiar in the right sense of the word. They're unique. Here, New Zealand is unique in having the lowest vote for learning analytics across all of the 18 key countries. So I'm just going to take a pause for a second and just ask why you think New Zealand is so different from the rest of the world. If anybody has anything to offer on that, I would like to know. In particular, I'm interested to know why you think coaching and mentoring rates so highly against the rest of the world. But any observations on that, I'd love to know more about your views on it. If I keep looking to one side, I've got my iPad here with my 76 slides on, so I know where I am. Yeah. Our leader, Maori, says that for valuable learning to take place, we have to share our breath. Very interesting. If there's any URL or anything to tell me where I can read more about that, Steve, I'd be very interested. Susan saying, you've got a high proportion of smaller companies struggle with investment needed for learning analytics. I definitely buy that, Susan. That's a really good point, that the size of an economy absolutely must affect this. So thank you for that. Good point. But I agree with you that coaching does generate long-term changes. What I'm interested in is that the people in New Zealand actually recognize that fact and see it. Whereas elsewhere in the world, very often it's a matter of saying, yeah, we should probably do coaching, but, and then they find the excuses. It's expensive, it's difficult to scale, and so on. And I like this idea that there's a huge drive, especially from the government, to increase support around the workers. This reflects the relative importance of people over tech. Yeah, I would agree with that. It does. Fundamental to Te Awa. I won't try to pronounce that, Phil, but yes. Bethany going along with that, the concept of it being a people-based place and collective and working together. And that's interesting, Bethany, because that's something which is very similar to the Brazilian view, which has been consistent over the years. It really has. Now, great point. Is coaching actually happening, or is there a resource issue? We'll come to that a bit later on. Emphasis shifting away from formal and techniques that engender continuous learning. Well, good for New Zealand. And companies have smaller learning teams, Vicky. Yeah, they do. Really interesting point. At some point, when I've got enough data, which may be now, I'm going to do a comparison between smaller countries like New Zealand, Netherlands, Sweden, where I've got consistent data, versus the larger countries, and see where things pull together and where they don't. A great point about the retention. Yeah, I've had that mentioned by other people, actually, Bernadette, the idea that, in fact, it was Ireland. Ireland always put coaching and mentoring high. It may be the same thing, actually. It's a small country. I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just geographically, and has a small population. But they definitely are seeing right now coaching and mentoring absolutely as being a retention tool, precisely about the Great Resignation. And they've been hit very bad by the tech issues in Ireland, because, of course, it's a tech center for Europe, particularly for American companies that come over and they establish themselves there. I love these discussions. And look, next year, or whenever it is that I'm down, we will have this discussion, not in your morning, but in your afternoon, and then we can go out for a drink and continue the discussion over a glass of your wine. I'm not obsessed by New Zealand wine, but I like a drop. Now, look, here's interesting. Let's look at, thank you for all that insight. I can't get that anywhere else in the world, so I really appreciate it. Let's look at New Zealand's vote versus last year. That's going to throw up something interesting about the whole point about data. I pointed out earlier that consulting with the business and showing value had jumped up this year. It was higher, if you remember this one, was higher in New Zealand than the rest of the world, but also it seems to have jumped up this year. AI is much higher as well in New Zealand, but actually AI is higher everywhere in the world. So the idea that it's jumped up this year versus last year in New Zealand isn't such a big thing. But it's interesting to look at those two, consulting and showing value, jumping up. Why is that? Well, I'll come to that in a second. Additionally, some things have dropped down. The collaborative thing actually is less this year. Microlearning mobile is down this year. Mobile delivery was very big last year. That's a huge drop from 7.2% to 1.9%. What was going on? Well, I think the answer is in how the votes were collected last year. So here are 5 years for New Zealand. Bizarrely, these three things I've chosen: mobile delivery, microlearning, and collaborative and social learning. They all start at the same point, but that's just coincidence. They go up and down. They're slowly trending downwards. But you can see that in 2022, there's this weird hiccup where everything goes upwards. All right, listen, Steve, I'm totally taking your top wine tips. I shall put those in my diary. So what happened in 2022? Why in particular did, for example, mobile delivery go up and consulting, if you remember, consulting and showing value came down that year? Well, for me, the answer is in how the votes were collected. And there's a clue to this in the number of people we had answering. Now, okay, 2021 wasn't a big year, 64 people. Typically, we have about 100 people answering from New Zealand. So we had a big number, 163 last year. Why was that? Well, it's because Bloom used this a technique to spread the vote more widely and get more people in. Get more people in. If you remember our Everett Rogers distribution curve, I said, well, what I was interested in was the people and the innovator and the early adopter section. But once you start opening up the gate wider, which I'm very happy to do, I think that we went beyond the early adopters and the innovators, and brought in people from a wider mix in L&D. Now, those people who are in a wider group in L&D, the early majority, it's like looking back in time. They are as excited about mobile delivery now as everybody else was typically 3 or 4 years ago. In other words, they are catching the wave that has come over. If something comes over from the early adopters, but I know, looking at the results, that showing value and collaborating more widely with the business, consulting more widely with the business, has not gone over, and so that vote is lower. So this just demonstrates some of the issues around how you sample your data and how it can be skewed when you're collecting data in. So I think overall the trends are correct, but last year was definitely a blip year. Just as a quick sense check, here's mobile delivery, and you can see it's totally for New Zealand in orange and for the world. You can see it's totally following the normal pattern there, going down as you'd expect, except for last year, where suddenly it looks like everyone in New Zealand's really interested in mobile delivery. But what's happened is we've pulled in a few extra people who are really keen on it, because they're people who are not at that leading edge of the adoption curve. Mind you, it doesn't happen with everything. You can see that with AI, New Zealand perfectly follows the adoption curve. So I think that the reaction to AI, what this tells me is that the reaction to AI in New Zealand, and in fact worldwide probably, is that everybody, almost everybody in learning development, is at a very early stage of understanding how on earth they can use AI for their work. That's another slide here. I'm just going to, oh, sorry, I wanted to just point this one out. I did quite a lot of work looking at New Zealand and Australia, trying to work out, well, okay, they're two very different countries, aren't they? They are, of course, two very different countries, but bizarrely, I couldn't find a lot of very great differences between them. And in fact, most of the graphs looked a bit like this. If you look at the world and New Zealand, there's a gap. It's consistent, but there's a gap in the views of AI. You look at Australia and New Zealand, there's much less of a gap, and the curve is the same shape. And this sort of thing happens all the time, looking at the two countries. So actually, although we like to think of the two great cricketing nations as being rivals, well, cricketing rugby nations, as being rivals and very different from each other, actually, probably they're a bit less unusual, a bit less unlike each other than we might think. Here's my summary slide, to which I should have added that New Zealand is more people-focused than tech-focused, which was the great point that you brought out in the discussion. Thank you. And yeah, 2022 was an abnormal year. And yeah, probably New Zealand isn't quite as different from Australia as you might think. Don't tell me I won't be invited back next year as a result of making that last comment, please.
As long as we beat them in the results, they're the numbers on the poll.
I'm afraid you didn't. I'm afraid Australia had a bumper year with more than 200 people coming in this year. You did a great job, but I'm afraid that they beat you this year. However, proportionately per head of population, of course, New Zealand won. I asked at the beginning, what's your greatest L&D challenge in 2023? And if you remember, 18,000 words from 1,600 people. And it's a privilege to read all these things, as I say, and understand what's going on in people's lives. I put them into buckets, categories, using a combination of actually reading everything and also just checking for 42 different words in all of the answers and find out which are the most popular. These categories make up about 76% of all the answers. And they're in the order in which things are seen as a challenge. So the top challenge is delivery, just getting the job done. And that reflects what we saw earlier with people talking about time, engagement, and so on. Strategy, they kind of overlap a bit with that, talent and skills. Stakeholders, we had earlier people talking about needing to convince people about the value of what they were doing. But actually, the one at the bottom, budget and resources, although it's the smallest one of those, it's quite a limited and well-defined category, whereas the other ones are quite broad, and so naturally more things fall into them. What was interesting is if you compare the actual words used, individual words used in this year versus last year, and I've only asked the question for 2 years, so I don't have more data than that, you can see that the words value, well, value and its various forms, valuing and so on, budget and impact were up this year. People engage and skill and their various permutations were down this year, along with a bucket of words that refer to the pandemic. That's COVID, online, hybrid, virtual, and digital were all down. And this is what it looks like. 120%, sorry, but so look, N equals 108. So it's not a huge number of people doing this, but it's still quite a lot. And it's the movement that's interesting. More than twice as many people this year as last year using the word budget in their answers to say, that's a challenge for me. And that really reflects what you were talking about earlier, wasn't it? That budget was an issue and resources generally. These words don't reflect it, but there were quite a few comments, as you were talking about earlier, where people were saying, yeah, we've got a problem being able to get skilled staff in. So value, impact were all part of it. And you can see then the other ones dropping away. I was slightly surprised that I wasn't surprised by engagement, because engagement was a big topic last year. Everyone had Zoom fatigue. But people being lower down, I thought was interesting this year. But I think it's not a big number, but I still think it's a significant number when you think that last year, the year before, it was all about people. It was all about sharing with each other and what have you. Now, people seem to be less important, just as we're shifting towards data. It's almost like some horrible pendulum has swung across, and we are not taking so much care about people anymore. This just echoes what I was saying about data. About budgets. I'm going to move on because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. The two options on the table that do not follow that pattern of falling away over time are showing value and consulting more deeply with the business. You can see here, over the past 8 years, they've stayed sort of in the middle. There was a slightly downward trend, and then from 2019 onwards, they've actually had a slight upward trend. I'm assuming that this means that there is a core of people in learning and development that take value and impact very seriously and keep going back to it year after year. And that proportion is pretty much the same as we increase the number of people voting, because we increased by about 500 people each year. So over that period of time, you can tell there's quite a few people joining us. I'm pleased that's the case. I think it also shows the answer to a problem we've got. I think when people are talking about budgets and resources, and people are talking about data, that if one is prepared to consult deeply with the business and then go and do stuff and come back and show value, or not show value, but take action in order to improve the value, I think that what this graph describes, the importance of those two things, is the solution to getting everything else done. You get your budget agreed if you get your stakeholders on board, and you get your stakeholders on board by showing them the value of what you've done by using that data that you've been collecting, and probably using AI to back up what you're doing. I say all that, but there's a caveat, which is, of course, that as we discussed earlier, ChatGPT was the driving force behind people being super enthusiastic about AI this year. In the conclusions, I just want to look at that and ask ourselves something. I talked about the wordscape earlier, this idea that we're surrounded by words, and when they are new, we are affected by them. Their sheer volume changes how we express ourselves. Sweden has always voted very highly for collaborative and social learning. It is a part of an area of the world, Northern Europe and Scandinavia in particular, where there's a strong tradition of folkbildning, which is the tradition of sharing and learning from each other after school. But in 2022, that was turned on its head, and there was a massive vote for reskilling and upskilling in Sweden. 17%. No other country has anything like that as a vote for its top option ever. What happened? I was puzzled by this. When I did my talk with the Swedes, I asked them about it, and they said, oh, well, it's all down to this book, Reskilling and Upskilling. I've got the book somewhere around here. Got it given to me by Per himself. Per Lager published the book in August. I started the survey in November. Everyone had been talking about it for a few months. It was just ChatGPT on a country scale rather than international scale. So my question to you is, are we too easily persuaded? As human beings, this is nothing about Swedes, and it's not about L&D. As human beings, because this is a general trait, are we too easily persuaded? Do we think that AI and artificial intelligence, which I've just been saying may be part of the answer, certainly data is part of the answer to solving our problems, is that just a flash in the pan? Is that like curation, one of those things that's going to fall away over time and, yeah, it was interesting, but a bit too difficult? Or is it like mobile delivery, something that's going to be absolutely generally used and really change the way things happen? So I'm going to have my last sip of tea. I'm almost at the bottom of my cup. And just ask you, what do you think it is? What do you think AI is like reskilling and upskilling in Sweden? Do you think it's just a fad, or do you think it's here to stay? And looking forward to any thoughts you've got on that. I'm interested in putting the wine back in the cellar. Once wine comes out the cellar, it never goes back in again in our house. So I'm impressed that you have the discipline to put it back in. Because we have 9 minutes left, I'm going to give my answer. Well, there we go. Michelle says here to stay. Quite a complex answer from, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, Kaya. AI is a long game. It will take a long time to upskill people to be able to use it, but by then something new might come along. Yep, might do. Similar to everything else on the Gartner hype cycle, trough of disillusionment on the horizon, but there'll be stable state in time, says Phil. It depends if tech companies deliver options that can be used quickly and cheaply. Helen says probably normalized. Bethany, probably a fad. So Bethany's describing the Gartner hype cycle trough of disillusionment. Steve, fad, it is highly thought of currently. We look at formalizing it, but do we trust it? Lorna says, are we not curious until proven useful? My view is that there's an arms race taking place amongst the big software providers at the moment about with AI generally, not just large language models, but AI generally. And it is, in my view, going to be one of the two things which in my 40-year lifetime of work in this field, the field of technology and learning, it's going to change things. The first was, I started programming computers in 1981. So the first thing that really changed the world for me was the World Wide Web, 1990 and onwards. I think the widespread use of low-cost tools, and a low-cost point is a very good one, low-cost tools in AI is absolutely going to mean that it will change things. Now, we won't necessarily see it. It may be that it's all under the hood and it's like the engine of a car. We don't really know what's going on, but we trust it. And I think the trust point is another good point, Steve. I think that it is going to absolutely change the way things are done. But I appreciate that, as we've seen in New Zealand, actually those three things, 2, 3, and 4 on the main table, were much less exciting than a lot of other things. AI will remain for the long term, Angela says, but it's not known yet what form it will take. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And already ChatGPT is kind of being sidelined by Bing and some other models that we've seen being used out there. Now, VR and AR, Helen, a great example of something that's between the fading away of curation and the generalization of mobile. It's what I call a niche product. It's a great product, and it's much cheaper, much easier to use than it was 5 years ago. But there was so much hype about it, it hasn't come back out that trough yet. It is something, however, that I think will come out into not general use, but niche use, where it's absolutely got a lot of applications. Let me wrap up, and then quickly let's have some questions if you want any. If you want to follow people on L&D and Data AI, here are some people with their LinkedIn handles to follow, and I'd also encourage you, that's what the 6th circle is about, I'd encourage you to go out and find other people to follow. But what I would say is this, that AI today is the lowest quality it will ever be. In 1997, I booked a honeymoon for me and my wife going to Africa to go on safari and stay in a lodge on the beach in Kenya. And I did it by reading a small ad in the Sunday Times, responding by letter. They responded. I wrote them a check. We booked it in. We turned up. We had very little idea what the place would look like and what it would be like. It was magnificent. But you can't imagine doing that now, can you? We just booked ourselves a holiday with the rest of the family, our kids, the rest of the family, 13 people going to Cordoba in Spain. We had a WhatsApp group discussing it. We had booking.com references going in there. People going backwards and forwards, checking out the temperatures, the times, the flights, all using these tools that are all made possible by the World Wide Web. That would have been incomprehensible in 1997. In a similar way, there is going to be stuff that's going to be happening in the next, certainly 20 years, but actually 10, even 5 years, it's going to be made possible by AI in ways that we probably can't even think about it at the moment. So just bear in mind that it looks a bit weird and perhaps a bit quirky now. I also think it's one of the two things in my lifetime that's going to make a massive change to how we live, learn, and work. Now, if you'd want to download the slides, there they are. I'll get them over to you as well Rustica so you can distribute them. And if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, feel free to do so. We've got 4 minutes left. Any questions, any thoughts anybody want to bring up? And you could do that. You could put them in the chat, or I don't know, we've got 28, 30 people in the room. We could probably just take the microphone if you want, but I'll leave that to Rustica to decide. That's interesting about the flight school. Yeah, Michelle, for niche applications, it can be great. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if people want to ask a question, they could just put their hand up and you could see their hands up.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I can't. I haven't got my grid view on.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Maybe just unmute. I can't see the grid either. If anyone's got a question, you just unmute yourself.
I think everyone's. Well, what time is it with you now?
Just morning. I've got a question I had pre-typed in case no one did.
There we go. Wow, that's a very good question. You know what? I as I'm not prepared for that question, I've got no idea what the answer is. But I can tell you that in 2007, I was desperate to find a mobile learning case study for the Learning Technologies Conference. I couldn't find one, which shows that these things are cyclical as well as being driven by other things. So the demand and interest was there in 2007 because of the iPhone, but the technology hadn't caught up with what people thought could happen. That was absolutely the case 5 years ago with AI. There was an awful lot of talk around it, but it wasn't delivering. Now we're in the bizarre position whereby we've sort of forgotten about it, but it's stolen a march, and actually the deliverable seems to be far ahead of what people were expecting. And I think, as everyone's suggesting here, the actual delivery of that will die away. Well, we'll catch up with our expectations of it, but I think for the short term, it is going to carry on driving away because there's so much money and effort being put into it, basically. And people see there being huge prizes. You know, the big tech giants all see there as being a huge prize to be had by getting there first. So we have to wait and see what happens. Okay, there we are. That's me. It's 2 minutes to. Cups of coffee are probably waiting for people, or the rest of the breakfast, or whatever else is happening. It's been a delight to be with you. Anything you want to sign off with at the end there, Rusty?
Just a big thank you. I know it's the end of your day, and you continue to support New Zealand getting the results, for New Zealand, and there's so many insights there that you've got. So
always a pleasure.
Everyone connects with you and that they get these slides. We'll also be sending the slides out, and anyone that's online that hasn't connected with me on LinkedIn, please do. My account was hacked and deleted last year. So I think I've got 103 followers. So I'd love to reconnect on my new profile.
Wow.
So
I'm following you. I'm following you.
I know. I think you were my follower number 3. Laurie Niles Hoffman was number 1. Got to get her on board.
Fair play. Fair
So
play.
you need to put her on your list of influencers to follow.
Well, she's definitely worth following. Absolutely.
100%. That's lovely. So thank you, Donald, and thanks everyone for joining, and those that were, took the poll and actually made those results possible. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely.
Good. All right. Thank you.
Maybe see you next year. Bye for now.